Warning. This episode includes discussion of mutilation, cannibalism, and the harming of children. Listener discretion is strongly advised. One spring afternoon in southern France, a group of girls were tending sheep near the edge of a forest. It should have been peaceful, but the sheep suddenly scattered. The dogs began to growl, and when they looked up, they saw him, a boy, sitting alone, watching them, smiling. Which one of you is the prettiest? Because I'd like to marry her. What they didn't know was that this same boy would later confess to killing and eating children and claim he wasn't always human.
Welcome to the Book of Lore.
I'm your host, Juan Lede. Werewolves have been around for as long as most of us can remember. We've seen them in movies, on TV, and always the same. Fangs, claws, glowing eyes, full moons. But that version, that's not where this started. So let me ask you something. Where did these stories actually come from? Because the werewolves we're talking about today, they weren't just monsters on the screen. People believed they were real. Not stories, real. And depending on where you were in the world, the way someone became a werewolf looked completely different. So today, we're going to explore that. Where the legend may have started, how people believe transformations happen, what changed when science stepped in and started asking a bunch of darker questions. What if these people weren't monsters, but people? Which brings us to this question. What is lycanthropy? At its core, lycanthropy is the idea that a human can transform into a wolf. Sometimes through magic, sometimes through ritual, and sometimes through something far darker. But here's where it gets interesting. There wasn't just one way this was supposed to happen. In some stories, witches were blamed. They could turn someone into a wolf, or a dog, or even something as harmless as a cow. Those transformations even had names. Coanthropy for dogs, and boanthropy for cattle. But witches weren't the only explanation. In ancient Greece, the gods themselves were said to transform people into beasts. Not a curse, but sometimes as punishment. Further north, in places like Scandinavia and Norway, people believed something different. That if you wore the skin of an animal, you could take on its strength, its instincts, its power. And in some traditions, all it took was an ointment, rubbed into the skin with a little help from something far less divine. So instead of one origin story, what we really have is a pattern. Different cultures, different methods, but the same core belief, that a human being could become something else. So let's start at one of the earliest places these stories show up, ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, the gods weren't just worshipped, they were feared, because they didn't just watch humans, they changed them, sometimes into animals, not just as punishment, but to move faster, hide more easily, or carry out something in secret. And one of the earliest stories tied to this idea comes from very early traditions in later Greek mythology. There's a story about a king named Lycaon of Arcadia. He invites Zeus into his home, feeds him, but what Zeus is given isn't food, it's human flesh. His own son, Nyctimus, and Zeus knows immediately. No hesitation, no warning. He turns Lycaon into a wolf, and the transformation isn't clean, it's violent, it's complete. Listen to how it's described. He tries to speak, but the words won't come. Foam fills his mouth, and all he craves is blood. He tears through the flock, driven by a violent, restless hunger. His body shifts, skin giving way to coarse hair, his limbs twisting into something no longer human. His mind slips fully into feral madness. His eyes still burn, sharp and wild, a reflection of pure, unrestrained fury. This isn't a story about monsters, It was a story about punishment. Because in these early beliefs, if you angered the gods, you didn't get forgiveness. You got changed. And that idea wasn't limited to Greece. Around the same time, there was a nomadic group known as the Scythians. They told stories about a people named the Neri, sorcerers who could turn themselves into wolves, not permanently, but once a year. For several days at a time, they would live like animals, then change back like nothing happened. Same person, different form. But even that wasn't the end of it. Because in the 5th century text, City of God by St. Augustine, we get another story. One that shows what happens when someone doesn't just witness transformation, but asks for it. Fotis pulls me to a crack in the door and tells me to look. Inside, Pamphil undresses, calm, deliberate. She opens the chest, takes out a small box and dips her hand into the dark, glistening ointment. Slowly, she spreads it all over her body, every inch of skin. Then she starts whispering, not to anyone in the room, but to a lamp. Low, unnatural words, like something listening back. Her body begins to move, jerky at first, then smoother, almost practiced, and then it happens. Her skin ripples, a small shimmer spreads across her body. Then feathers. They don't grow gently. They push through, quills bursting from her flesh. Her face twists, hardens, her nose snapping forward into a hooked beak. Her toes curl, split, talons scraping against the floor. She's gone. In her place, an owl. It lets out a sharp, grating scream, testing its wings, lifting, rising, and then, just like that, it disappears into the night. I can't move. I just stand there, staring, trying to convince myself I didn't just see that. But I did. So I turn to Fotis and grab her hand. I tell her, I need that ointment. She hesitates, then brings it to me anyway. The moment it's in my hands, I can't think straight. I'm already imagining it. Lifting off the ground, escaping, becoming something else. I don't waste time. Clothes off, hands in the box, I smear it over my body. Too much, too fast. And then I wait. I start moving my arms like I saw her do, faster, harder. Nothing. Then, something's wrong. My skin tightens, hardens. Not feathers, no. It's thickening, warping, stretching into something coarse, animal. Hair forces its way out. My hands, my fingers, they're fusing, disappearing. My feet split, flatten, hooves slamming against the ground. I feel my spine pull, extend, something tearing as a tail forces its way out behind me. I try to scream, but my mouth, it won't form the words. I stagger, trying to understand what's happening, but it's already too late. This isn't a transformation, it's a mistake. And when it's over, when I finally catch my reflection, I realize the truth. I didn't become a bird. I became an ass. By the time we move closer to the Middle Ages, these ideas start to shift. Now, we're not just talking about gods, we're talking about witches. Witches, sorcerers, practitioners of magic, gathering in secret, at night, in hidden places, at what some accounts called the Devil's Sabbath. These weren't just meetings, they were rituals, feasts, ceremonies, and in some stories, they didn't even appear as human. They came disguised as animals, something small, something easy to overlook, like a house cat. Because at the time, being discovered meant death. Persecution was growing, fear was spreading. So they adapted, they hid. And one of the ways these transformations was said to have happened was through something called a salve. A salve wasn't just an ointment, it was a trigger. Something you rubbed into the skin that allowed a person to become something else. Not instantly, not explosively, but deliberately, controlled. In many traditions, this was a method. No dramatic spell, no lighting, just a quiet ritual and a change that followed. And it didn't just turn you into a wolf. Depending on the story, it could be a dog, a cow, or something else entirely. And when it was time to come back, the same process reversed it. But what made these stories darker was what people believed went into it. Ingredients like nightshade and belladonna, opium mixed together, boiled down, sometimes with oil, and in the most disturbing versions of the story, something far worse. And the salve wasn't the only way. In some traditions, water itself was enough. On the night of transformation, the person would go to a pond or a lake, step in, disappear beneath the surface, and when they came back up, they weren't human anymore. And when it was over, when the night was done, they'd return to the same water and change back, like nothing ever happened. And that idea that transformation can be controlled, repeated, even hidden, leads us to the next story, the Perigold. In the Perigold region, werewolves go by a different name, the Lulari. According to the legend, certain men, especially those born out of wedlock, are cursed to transform with every full moon. And it never happens in the daylight, the change comes at night. When it begins, the afflicted doesn't hesitate. He bolts for the nearest window, throws himself out into the dark, and makes his way to a well. There, he plunges into the water, struggling, thrashing, until he emerges, changed. Waiting for him is a goat skin, a gift, it's said, from the devil himself. Once he puts it on, the transformation is complete. The Lulari drops to all fours and disappears into the countryside, hunting, tearing through livestock, attacking anything he crosses paths with. Nothing is safe, not even dogs. By dawn, it's over. The creature remains, sheds the goat skin, and goes back home before anyone can see. But the body remembers. The next day, he's violently ill. Sometimes vomiting up pieces of what he devoured the night before, fur, flesh, even paws. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Unlike some werewolf legends, the Lulari can be injured or even killed while in its transformed state. And if it bleeds, the illusion breaks. The beast disappears, and in its place lies a man, exposed. And if you're wondering how to recognize one before it's too late, the stories offer a warning. Look at their hands. They'll seem off. Too broad, fingers too short, almost like a paw. And if you look closely, there may even be hair growing from the palms. So if you ever start to suspect someone, that might be where you check first. But I want to pause for a second and go back, because this story, it's a little different from what we've talked about so far. Up to this point, we've seen transformation happen through things like salves or water, but here it's something else, because when they come out of the water, they're not just changed, they're wearing something, a skin, a goat skin, and that detail matters, because across different cultures, that idea shows up again and again. That transformation isn't just something that happens to you, it's something you put on. In Normandy, these figures are known as here. In parts of Norway and Iceland, they were called something else, Ege Ingemir, which roughly means not of one skin. And that idea comes from something deeper, an older belief that a person could take on another body, not just physically, but completely. Its instincts, its power, its nature. In those traditions, the second body had a name. It was called Hammer. And the act of changing, of moving from one body to another, had its own language too. Skeptahamum, or Adhamas. And what you did while you were in that second form, that was called Hamfer. And here's where it gets interesting. Because in these stories, you don't lose yourself. You're still aware, still thinking, still you, just stronger, faster, sometimes far more dangerous. And all of this leads us to a third type of transformation, one we haven't fully explored yet: transformation through animal skin or pelt. And depending on the story, there were a few different ways this could happen. Sometimes it's simple: put on the skin and the transformation is immediate. Other times, it's something stranger. The body is left behind, completely still, almost lifeless, while the soul moves into another form. A borrowed body, or one created just for that purpose. And in other cases, nothing changes at all, at least not physically. Instead, it's everyone else who's affected. Their vision is altered, so what they see is something entirely different. 3 different methods, same idea: the ability to become something else, and the next story shows exactly what that looks like. This comes from the saga of the Volsungs, and it follows a father and a son who find out exactly what happens when you put the skin on. Sigmund didn't believe Sinfoli was ready for revenge, not yet. He wanted proof, so that summer they went deep into the forest and they tested him. They lived like outlaws, hunting men instead of animals, killing for gold, for survival, for something darker. And as the days passed, Sigmund saw it clearly. The boy was Volsung, ruthless, capable. Then, one night, everything changed. While moving through the forest, they came across a house. Inside, 2 men, asleep, heavy gold rings still on their hands, but something felt wrong. Hanging over them were wolf skins. These men weren't ordinary. They practiced witchcraft, and according to the lore, once those skins were worn, the wearer was trapped in that form for 10 days. Sigmund and Sinfoli didn't hesitate. They killed the men and took the skins. But the moment they put them on, they couldn't take them off. The change hit instantly. Not just their bodies, but their minds. They became wolves. Not pretending, not disguising. Wolves. They fled into the forest, splitting up to hunt. Before they did, they made a pact: never take on more than 7 men at once, and if either of them found trouble, they'd call out with a wolf's howl. Sigmund warned them, don't get reckless. Men would gladly hunt you down. Then they went their separate ways. Not long after, Sigmund found a group of men, and he howled. Sinfoli heard it and came running. By the time he arrived, it was already over. Every man was dead. Then they parted ways. But soon, Sinfoli found another group, 11 men. He attacked anyway, 1 against 11, and he slaughtered every single one of them. Afterward, exhausted, he collapsed beneath an oak tree. That's where Sigmund found him. Why didn't you call for me? He demanded. Sinfoli looked at him and said, why would I need help for 11 men? That was the wrong answer, and Sigmund snapped. He lunged at him, feral, furious, and torn to his throat. Sinfoli dropped, and just like that, the blood settled. The rage passed, but the damage was done. They were still trapped in their wolf forms. There was no undoing it. Not yet. So, Sigmund lifted his son, carried him back to the hall, and sat beside him in silence. Then, finally, to hell with these wolfskins. So in the story of Sigmund and Sinfoli, the moment they put on those wolfskins, that was it. No ritual, no delay. The transformation was immediate. They don't just look like wolves. They became them. But not every story works like that. Some take it a step further, because in the next account, the body doesn't change at all. This comes from the Folklore saga. And it tells a story of 3 men who were given a very specific task. They were sealed inside a hut for 3 days. No movement and no contact from the outside world. They looked completely still. Almost dead. But they weren't. Because where their bodies stayed, something else left. Their souls sent out to travel, to scout new land, to find a place their people could settle. And when they returned, when those 3 days were over, they woke up and described everything they had seen, accurately, every detail. And what's interesting here is that the story never tells us what form they took. Because in this tradition, it didn't have to be a wolf. It could be anything, any animal, whatever was needed to complete the task. Which brings us back to this idea of Hammer. Not just becoming a beast, but taking on another form entirely, with purpose, with control. And that leads us to the final transformation type. Because sometimes, this wasn't about power or exploration. Sometimes it was about survival, about protection, about doing whatever it took to save someone you loved. And the next story is exactly that. Garrett, a housewife, sent word to Bolstad. She knew the truth. Odd, Katla's son, had cut off Odd's hand. When Thorin and Arnkel heard, they didn't waste time. They gathered 12 men and rode through the night, and by the morning arrived at Katla's farm. Odd was inside. Katla sat in the high seat, calmly spinning yarn. She pulled Odd close beside her and quietly instructed her household, "Stay seated, say nothing. I'll handle this." Then, the minute Arnkel greeted her and asked for news, Katla played it cool, saying Odd had already left for Breidavik. Arnkel didn't buy it. "We'll search the house," he said. Katla didn't resist. She had a servant bring a light and guide them through every room. They searched everything, and somehow they found nothing. All the while, Katla sat there, spinning. So they left. But not far from the house, Arnkel stopped. Something just didn't sit right. "What if she tricked us?" he said. "What if that distaff in her hand was Odd?" They turned back. This time, as they approached, Katla stepped outside. She stood in the doorway, calmly grooming what looked like a goat, stroking it, untangling its hair. The men went inside again. Still nothing. They saw the distaff lying there untouched, so it couldn't have been Odd. They left. But once more, Arnkel hesitated. And what if he was the goat? No one had an answer, so they turned back a third time. Now, Katla was running out of options. She dragged Odd to the ash heap and forced him down into it. "Don't move," she told him. "Not for anything." When the men stormed in again, Katla was exactly where she'd been before. Spinning, calm, composed. She even mocked him. "You're visiting often today." This time, they tore the place apart. They even split her distaff in two. Still, no Odd. Nothing alive anywhere, except a single pig lying in the ash heap. So they left. Again. But halfway back, they were met by Garrett herself. She told them plainly they'd been fooled, and this time she would make sure they weren't. So they turned around for a fourth time. Now, Katla saw them coming, and she saw Garrett among them, and that's when the fear set in. "That woman," Katla muttered. "I won't be able to cloud their eyes anymore." Desperate, she lifted the cushion from her seat, and beneath it, a hollow space. She shoved Odd inside, covered it, and sat down over him, waiting. When they entered, the room felt different. No warmth, no courtesy. Garrett stepped forward, removed her blue cloak, and without a word, threw a sheepskin bag over Katla's head. Then she gave the order, "Break the seat." They did, and there was Odd. No illusions left, no hiding place. They dragged him away to Buhead's land and hanged him. As for Katla, they took her beneath the cliff and stoned her to death. So, how many times did she do it? How many times did Katla manage to hide him, right in front of them, before everything finally fell apart? Because stories like that, they weren't always about power. Sometimes they were about survival, about protecting someone, about doing whatever it took to keep them safe. But eventually, the way people looked at these stories started to change. By the time we reach the Middle Ages, something shifts. The belief in witches and transformations and bloodthirsty beasts, it doesn't disappear. It starts to be questioned, replaced slowly by something else. Science, observation, explanation. And at the same time, something darker is happening. Because this is also when the witch trials and werewolf trials began, the 15th and 16th centuries. And instead of asking, what kind of creature is this? People start asking, what kind of person does this? And from that point on, there were three main ideas used to explain what was happening. Not magic, not curses, but causes. Innate cruelty, cannibalism, and hallucinations. Now, that first one, innate cruelty, is the one that unsettles people the most because it meant there was no trigger. No full moon, no spell, no outside force. Just a person who wanted to kill. Not out of hunger, not out of madness, but because they chose to, because they could. And that kind of person is unpredictable, dangerous, in a way that's hard to understand. Which brings us to the next case, a man named Dolamard, a pauper, someone who, at first glance, didn't seem like much at all. But what he did tells a very different story. Dolamard was responsible for the deaths of at least 6 young girls, and he attempted to kill several more. But what makes his case different isn't just the violence, it's the reason. Because for him, it wasn't about the act itself. It wasn't rage, it wasn't even pleasure. It was indifference. He killed them for their clothes. Not valuables, not wealth, just clothing. Not even expensive clothing, the poorest kind. That was enough. He was eventually captured, tried, and executed by guillotine in 1862. And cases like his force people to start asking a different question. Not, is this a monster? But, what kind of mind creates this? And that brings us to another belief, one that sits right in between the supernatural and the psychological. The idea that humans and animals don't just share the world, but something deeper, a soul. In some traditions, it is believed that during transformation, these souls could switch, a human soul entering a beast, or a beast's nature taking over a human. This idea had a name, metempsychosis. And the belief was simple. If those two forces weren't balanced, one would take over, completely. And when that happened, what remained might look human, but behave like something else entirely. Which leads us to the second explanation, cannibalism. In the next case, a man named Jacques Roulet shows exactly what that looks like when the line between man and beast completely breaks down. In 1598, a case came out of Angers, France, one that would become infamous in the history of lycanthropy. Near the village of Caude, in a remote stretch of land, a group of men discovered the body of a boy about 15 years old. It had been brutally mutilated and covered in blood. As they approached, 2 wolves feeding on the corpse fled into the bush. The men gave chase, following the blood trail as far as they could until they lost it. Then they saw him. Crouched in the bushes, trembling, was a man, half naked, long, tangled hair, a beard, his hands soaked in blood. His nails were overgrown, almost like claws, and packed with fresh gore and fragments of human flesh. His name was Jacques Roulet, and he didn't deny it. He confessed, calmly, that he had attacked the boy, smothered him, and begun to eat him, only stopping when the others arrived. An investigation revealed Roulet, a wandering beggar, was living in extreme poverty. He traveled with his brother, Jean, and his cousin, Julien, but at the time of the killing, he had been missing for over a week. When brought before the court, Roulet made an even more disturbing claim. He said he could transform into a wolf. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. According to him, it was done using an ointment given to him by his parents. And those 2 wolves seen at the scene, he said they weren't wolves at all. They were his companions, Jean and Julien, who shared the same secret. Despite this, evidence showed both men were elsewhere at the time. Roulet, however, remained consistent. He correctly described the victim, the location, the timing, even identifying the boy's father as one of the first to arrive after the attack. But something was clearly wrong. In prison, Roulet's behavior was erratic, disconnected. At times, he seemed completely unhinged. He drank excessive amounts of water, then refused food altogether. When questioned, his answers only grew stranger. "What is your name?" the judge asked. "Jacques Roulet, I'm 35. I'm poor. A beggar." "What are you accused of?" "Of theft and of offending God." This ointment, did you turn into a wolf? No, but I killed and ate the child. I was a wolf. He insisted his body changed, his hands, his feet, but couldn't clearly describe how. He claimed he had killed before, that he had eaten other children. The court initially sentenced him to death, but the case didn't end there. It was appealed to the Parliament of Paris, and their conclusion was different. They ruled that Roulet was not a man driven by witchcraft, but by madness. His sentence was reduced. Instead of execution, he was confined to a mental institution for 2 years, where it was said he might be brought back to God after losing himself completely. Up until this point, everything we've talked about, witchcraft, animal skins, deals with something darker. It all lives in the world of belief, myth, legend. But eventually, it starts to change. Because as we move closer into the Middle Ages, especially in the places like Scandinavia, people begin reporting something different. Not transformations, but what they call wolf madness. And during the trials that followed, something becomes clear. This isn't being treated as something supernatural anymore. It's being questioned, examined, reframed. Not as a curse, but as something happening in the mind. And we see that clearly in the case of Jacques Roulet, because Roulet believed it completely. He claimed he could transform, that he used a salve, that he became a wolf, but when you look at his responses, when you read what he says in court, something doesn't line up. His answers shift, they contradict, they drift. Not like someone hiding the truth, but like someone who's lost hold of it. And today, we wouldn't call that transformation. We call it something else, cannibalism. Because when you take that belief, that craving for blood, that violence, and combine it with instability, what you get is something far more human. And cases like Roulet's start to point in a different direction, towards something internal, something psychological. Which brings us to the final explanation, hallucination. Because in some cases, the transformation isn't physical at all. It's perception. A person can become so convinced, so consumed by what they believe they are, that it replaces reality. This is like Roulet, a man who truly believed he was a wolf. Not pretending, not lying, believing it. And when belief reaches that point, the line between man and beast starts to disappear. Which brings us to the final story of this episode. One of the most disturbing cases on record. A boy named Jean Grenier. One spring afternoon in southern France, a group of village girls were tending sheep along the sand dunes between the pine forest of lands and the sea. It should have been peaceful. The sky was clear, the air fresh off the Bay of Biscay. Birds moved through the trees, the wind humming through the pines. The girls laughed, talked, chased butterflies, just another ordinary day, until something changed. The sheep suddenly bolted. One of the dogs began to growl. The girls ran toward a dip in the sand and saw him, a boy, maybe 13, sitting on a fallen log. There was something wrong with him. His hair was thick, matted, a dull reddish color hanging over his face. His eyes, small, pale, sunken deep, flickered with something sharp. Not fear, something predatory. His teeth showed when he smiled, too wide, too eager. His hands were large, the nails dark and pointed like claws. His clothes hung in rags from a thin, underfed body. The girls gathered around him, uneasy, but he wasn't surprised to see them. He grinned. "Which one of you is the prettiest?" he asked. "I'd like to know, so I can marry her." They laughed it off at first, nervous, confused. Jeannie, the oldest, spoke up. "That's assuming any of us would have you." The boy didn't react. "I'm the son of a priest," he said flatly. One of the girls mocked him, asked if that explained why he looked so wild. He shook his head. "I look like this because I wear a wolf skin." That got their attention. They asked where he got it. His answer came with a strange, broken laugh. "From a man named Pierre Lebrun." No one had heard the name. Then his laugh changed. It twisted into something harsher, almost inhuman. The girls stepped back, and then he told them about a man with an iron chain around his neck, gnawing on it endlessly, about a place of fire and darkness where people burned over and over again. He spoke like he'd seen it, like he'd been there. Then he leaned forward. The wolf skin, he gave it to me. When I wear it on certain days at dusk, I become a wolf. The girls went silent. I've killed dogs, he said, drunk their blood. Then, almost casually, but little girls taste better. That was enough. They ran. They didn't stop until they were far from him, but the story didn't end there. Near the village of Saint Antoine de Paysan, a girl named Marguerite Poirier, 13 years old, had been tending sheep with a boy named Jean Grenier, the same boy. She had complained about him before, said he told her horrible things. No one took it seriously. Until one day, she came home early, terrified, shaking. She told her parents what happened. She'd been alone in the fields when she heard something in the bushes. Then he leapt at her, tearing into her clothes with his teeth. She fought it off with her staff, striking it again and again until it backed away. She said it looked like a wolf, but not quite. Shorter, broader, red-haired, with a strange, stunted tail. And the way it looked at her, she ran. That was when people started to listen, because children had begun disappearing, quietly, recently, and now there was a name, Jean Grenier. When he was arrested, Jean didn't resist. He talked freely, said he had made a pact with something he called the Lord of the Forest, said he'd been given an ointment and a wolf skin. That's how it happened, he claimed. That's how he changed. He admitted to attacking Marguerite, said he meant to kill her, and he didn't stop there. He confessed to killing other children, described it in detail, places, times, even the wounds. In one case, he said he pulled a baby from its cradle, carried it outside, and ate it. In another, he attacked a girl in the fields and killed her with his teeth. Investigators checked his claims. The locations matched, the timelines matched, the injuries matched. He even identified victims and people who had tried to stop him. Piece by piece, his story lined up. When brought to trial, the court faced a problem. Not whether he was guilty, but what he was. A killer, a liar, or something deeply broken. The presiding judge made it clear this wasn't about werewolves. Not really. He argued that transformation, witchcraft, all of it, was delusion. That whatever Jean believed, the real issue was his mind, his age, his neglect. A child raised without guidance, left to become something feral. The court made its decision. Jean Grenier would not be executed. He would be in prison for life in a monastery. But even there, something wasn't right. Shortly after arriving, he was found running through the gardens on all fours. Later, he came across a pile of raw animal remains and devoured them, completely. Years passed. When he was visited again, he had changed, but not in a way anyone hoped. He was smaller, withdrawn, avoided eye contact. But the hunger, that hadn't gone away. He admitted it himself. He still craved raw flesh, but still thought about it, still wanted it. And if he had the chance, he said he would do it again. Jean Grenier died at 20, after 7 years in confinement. But the question lingered long after him. Not whether he was a wolf, but how close a human being could come to becoming one. So in both cases, Roulet and Grenier, the courts came to the same conclusion. Not witchcraft, not transformation, but something happening in the mind. From that point on, lycanthropy wasn't treated as a curse anymore, but as an illness, something to be studied, contained, explained. And even with that explanation, there's still something unsettling about it. Because if the monster was never real, then what does that make the person? Someone who believes it? Or worse, someone who doesn't need to. And that's what makes these stories linger. Not the idea of a werewolf, but how close a human being can come to becoming one. And that marks the end of entry number 1 in the Book of Lore. If any of these stories stood out to you, or if you've heard others like them, I want to hear about it. You can find the show at Book of Lore Pod on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads. And if there's a story you think we should cover, send it in. Every story has a place here. So until next time, stay safe. And if you hear something moving in the dark, don't go looking for it, because it may already know you're there. New episodes of the Book of Lore release every Tuesday. Please rate, follow, and review. It greatly helps the show. Have any other lovers of lore in your life? Share with your friends, family, and loved ones to help the show become a place for lovers of the spooky, mythical, and creepy to come together. You can follow the show on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads at Book of Lore Pod. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.